Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. And I do apologize. I wasn't with you this morning, but the organizing committee continued to do an excellent job, and I'm pleased to be back and be with you. So we are going to move on with the third panel. The title of that panel's presentations is Creative Writing and Digital Humanities and Healing Practices. And the chair of the panel is Dr. Michael Rolfe, who is the chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies here at Howard University. So please help me invite them to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. So pleasure to join you here today in honor of a tremendous scholar and man, Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. I imagine that this panel was in many ways inspired by both his work in short stories and novels, as well as a really important edited volume that he helped to edit called Leisure in Urban Africa some years ago. Part of what was so important about that text was that it was very innovative conceptually, sort of encouraging us to think about how leisure is not something sort of incidental or
as well as a really important edited volume.
It's like there's some sort of audio challenges, but
leisure.
The text is important partly because it helps us to theorize leisure as something that's equally important and sort of helps to structure, let's say, labor practices, various kinds of social practices and things like that. It also helps us to think about play and sport as experimental sort of forms that help to build solidarity and shape and reshape social institutions. So I think in this panel on creative writing and digital humanities and healing practices, we'll see writers engage with different facets of Dr. Zeleza's work, besides economic history, as well as his writing and work on leisure, labor, and how the two are intertwined. So with that said, our first paper will be given by Melvin Page from East Tennessee State University, and his talk is entitled, A Writer with an Ear, Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. And Melvin will be joining us virtually, so please draw your attention to the screen and join me in welcoming Dr. Page. Dr. Page, can you hear us?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, we're ready for you whenever you're ready to start.
Are we online with each other here, I hope?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I want to say that while academics are seldom able to celebrate sounds like we are struggling a little. Oh, there we go. We are seldom able to celebrate the achievements of a pupil, especially as both are reaching the advanced stages of their careers. Thus, it's a distinct pleasure to do exactly that in honoring my former student, Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. We're fortunate to have met during the end of what he has come to describe as the golden era for African universities. When I assumed my first academic position at the University of Malawi's Chancellor College, he was one of my students, immersed in the study of both history and English. It seemed to me that he was torn by the close but complicated connections between the two disciplines, and he has long since acknowledged that for him this is a relationship I grapple with in my own personal and professional life as a historian and a creative writer. My own career, such tensions actually occurred much later. Only after my retirement was I too tempted by the freedom of writing, as my former student so aptly put it, not encumbered by the strict discursive structures of the academic enterprise. Nonetheless, my own proclivities as a historian are perhaps clearly evident in my own novel. My novel is titled Distinguished Conduct. My experience gives me some necessary perspective, I believe, in attempting to examine the dimensions of Paul Zeleza, the writer. I make no claims to have carefully studied his entire corpus of work, yet what I know of his career and writing leaves me confident extolling his abilities to incorporate what he hears and learns into consistently extraordinary messaging. I was able to recognize fundamental critical abilities in the young Paul Zeleza, which led me to seek him out along with others among my more engaged pupils, hoping that I might engage all of them in a critical research effort. Excuse me. He acknowledges that connection in the opening of his short story, The Soldier Without an Ear. Many years ago, while I was a student, I did research for one of my history lecturers. He was writing a doctoral thesis and was trying to find out the reaction of the people of the country to the two world wars. Of course, that lecturer he mentions was none other than myself. I wish to involve my students not just in my research, but in exploring the history of their country themselves. I asked a number of students, including Zeleza, to ask questions of some of their friends and neighbors when they went home on vacations. And they filled out questionnaires, returned the questionnaire responses to me, and many of those forms they returned have served as corroborating evidence, not merely in my doctoral dissertation, but in several published articles, as well as subsequent monographs. As far as I'm aware, Zeleza is the only one of them to have drawn on that experience, mentioning it in their own published writing. I have no doubt that my transferred curiosities took Zeleza into the Biwi village of his story, where he encountered his character Baba Fule, inspiring a very believable tale of wartime adventure and assumed consequences. Zeleza's story ends as he almost absent-mindedly asks, "Baba, did you get your ear cut during the wars?" Only then does he discover it was Baba's wife who was responsible. She cut it off one night in my sleep for being unfaithful to her. This unexpected conclusion, of course, carries a potent message. not merely for me, but for other historians as well. We should ascribe too much to the effect these global conflicts had on the lives of individual Africans has been too often some historians. Such healthy skepticism has remained characteristic of Zeleza's thought ever since, and I trust his reminder has helped me consider carefully all that I have written over a long career. And I remain mindful of his caution from the process of co-learning between students and their teachers, which he has astutely described. Zeleza's stories have similar origins, paying close attention to African accounts of their own lives. Certainly his willingness as a writer to pose questions, not just of individuals, but in challenging the very fabric of society as he finds it, is displayed in his fiction. Excuse me. Certainly his masterful novel, Smoldering Charcoal, one which has a sense of historical realism that shows the readers what life in Malawi was like in the past. Zeleza's careful creation, including much more effectively than most other writers, including political scientists, conveyed a troubling reality of Malawi. More than 2 decades ago, I acknowledged this achievement, suggesting that Zeleza's novel displayed a descriptive power that not only personal experience, his own and that gleaned from others, could provide. I confidently suggested then it was an area where Zeleza outshines his Malawi novelist predecessors. As an author alert to the many problems and conundrums found on the continent, even when I first knew him, it's unsurprising that Zeleza's further study have carried him further from Chancellor College and opened doors into a number of subsequent opportunities. One of those took him to Kenya, where, a little more than a decade after our first contact, we were briefly reunited as colleagues on the history faculty of Kenyatta University, while I was on a short-term faculty exchange program. Ours was a cordial acquaintance rather than a deep friendship during my stay in Kenya. The most significant interactions we had came in departmental seminars, similar academic encounters, where I again saw his eager engagement with others, always attentive, absorbing ideas which he had used to enrich his writing. As he acknowledged in his book, Modern African Economic History, it was extensive conversations with his colleagues at Kenyatta University, and moreover, as he put it, their faith in my ability to undertake a synthesis of such a scope, which led him to complete that endeavor, ultimately winning the prestigious Noma Award for Publishing in Africa. When I learned that a former student had won such an honor, I sought out other examples of his writing, wishing to learn more about the Malawi I first knew and then the Kenya I so briefly encountered. My initial focus had been on Zeleza, the creative writer. I found his fiction especially enlightening, as well as professionally punctual, with the awareness of the voices he was hearing. Reassessing Africa's challenges after the new millennium, however, brought me once again to Zeleza, the historian and social scientist. Amid crucial transitions in African life, he remained attuned to African voices, both in the diaspora and on the continent itself. Listening so carefully to those voices, at least in my estimation, sets his analysis of a changing Africa, apart from that of many others. However, our career trajectories began to diverge even as we both assumed official academic leadership positions. His abilities to listen and not only then share the voices he was hearing, which I had observed and seen years before and continued in his fiction, were unaffected. His energetic level of such interaction led to a reincarnation into higher levels of university administration. Maintaining an awareness of the voices all about him as he did so, it helped him in describing a critical bifurcation of African studies in the United States. Excuse me. pioneered at the historical Black colleges and universities, he explained, and I would notably add, by the way, by Carter G. Woodson at Howard University. That beginning was eclipsed at predominantly white universities. Being an African himself, Zeleza actually brought a further necessary perspective to the field, interjecting a crucial and somewhat personal dimension into the expanding awareness of more comprehensive African studies efforts. While my former student was thus expanding his vision, I was actually narrowing my own. I am proud to say that Howard University played a significant role in my own career, introducing me to African studies as an academic specialization. Thus, I benefited from both the African American and the Euro American tradition in African studies that Zeleza has described. And then only temporarily went on an academic administrative track myself, but soon changed course, seizing an opportunity to focus instead on the more generic process of writing about history, which has become a preoccupation of mine for more than 2 decades now. Yet, as even that excursion began winding down, I too started thinking and writing once more about both Malawi and perhaps more importantly, African studies generally. Given my early emphasis on wartime Africa, where Zeleza first found me, it was perhaps natural I might center some of my later focus on what I called the eras of African military history and its traditions. And I was decrying the usual tripartite periodization of African history, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, as unduly privileging an external imperialism as a defining centerpiece of Africa's past. This persistence of what he calls the persistence of the colonial gaze in the periodization of African past had too long dominated the continent's historiography, and this troubled me. While I might wish to suggest my efforts years ago when I hoped to engage Zeleza and his fellow Chancellor College students in listening to the voices of their countrymen and women, recounting meaningful historical experiences, actually, that this might have inspired such a pattern of thought, leading one of them to a career as distinguished as that of Paul Tiyambe Zeleza, I am doubtful is the case. Nonetheless, his ability to be ever aware of the voices all about him, even seeking out dissenting views, has informed Zeleza's writing from his earlier works. Unlike the soldier in his early story, he has not lost an ear. Rather, he has adopted what I might term an ear to the ground approach, which has served him well, not only enriching his writing, but setting a standard for others of us who believe in the value of Africa and its people. And in the process, his achievements have, without any doubt, surpassed my own. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Page. Thank you, audience, as well, for coping with some of our audio challenges. But that was a great paper, very nuanced, and it gives us profound insight into Dr. Zeleza's methodology and sort of trajectory. Our next speaker, Dr. Violet Gumbwa from the University of Malawi, will be presenting a paper, also virtually, and then we'll have several papers by speakers here in person with us. It's called Exploring Postcolonial Migration and Paul Tiyambe Zeleza's The Joys of Exile.
Thank you so much. When I first when I first saw the call to abstracts, the first literary that came to my mind was Smoother Charcoal, because that's something I learned in secondary school. And I had to go back to his works and try to find other literary works that I could try to work with. So the collection of short stories, The Joys of Exile, is one of such literary works, where Zeleza focuses on the issue of exile So The Joys of Exile exemplifies Zeleza's writing of the time of Banda. But this writing could also have been done so because he himself was in exile, and that somehow provided him the freedom to criticize the regime of the time. So Paul Tiyambe Zeleza has argued that exile is exceedingly common in modern Africa, indeed in the world at large, and that so much that it could even be seen as one of the major characteristics of the 20th century. Yet it remains difficult to define as a concept and a condition. So Zeleza's The Joys of Exile exemplifies the realities of most Malawians during the reign of Dr. Hastings Banda. This was a period characterized by political oppression and dictatorship, as most Malawians fled into exile during Banda's reign. The Joys of Exile focuses on both the metaphorical condition of exile as well as the literal condition of exile. In a way, it transgresses both the physical and spiritual borders. As one of the short stories, Waiting, which explores the life of a spirit child that considers human life as exile. It is thus the aim of this presentation to analyze how Zeleza portrays the issue of migration from the post-colonial point of view in the African context. So this presentation will focus on 4 short stories, namely Waiting, Blood Feuds, School Reunion, and Suspended Dreams. So the aim of the presentation is to analyze how Zeleza portrays the issue of migration from the post-colonial point of view in the African context. Susan P. Maines et al. Have argued that the colonial era facilitated new movements of people around the world, such as slaves and indentured workers from the colonies, as well as settlers, administrators, and adventurers from the colonial center. Later, the post-colonial era brought about movements of people from the formerly colonized peripheries to the colonial center, particularly in the UK, France, and the Netherlands. They also contend that for some time, the primary spatial narrative constructed in most migration literature has been the movement from there to here or from here to there. So most of the focus has been on movement across distance and the difference this has made to the places which people leave behind or come to. However, postcolonial has challenged as it has extended the temporality of the discussion by recognizing the extent to which today's migrations draw on colonial histories. Similarly, Sabella Bobode Abide and Brenda I. Gill have argued that movement within and outside the African continent are rooted in African history. Africa has experienced a lot of human activities and events that have had direct bearings on population movements. From empire to slavery to colonialism and post-colonialism, the African population has been a flow of humanity. Internal migration in Africa is far more significant in numbers and impact than intercontinental migration. In analyzing the joys of exile, Brighton J. Uledi Kamanga says the work is dominated by the experience of human alienation. So Kamanga focuses on alienation and argues that the cosmopolitan detachment stems directly from Zeleza's own status of exile, which is in itself a form of alienation, as it entails his physical separation from Malawi, his original country. He contends that the various forms of human alienation depicted in this collection come through as various states of literal or metaphorical exile in themselves. He argues that human alienation in all its forms is a state of existential exile, as it entails, and individual's metaphorical absence from his natural state being. So the concept of human life as a state of exile from a blissful spiritual experience is a central motive of the joys of exile, and therein lies the irony of the title. The title itself states that this is the joys of exile, and yet there's nothing joyful about the exile depicted in the collection. Exile is a critical issue in Zeleza's short story collection, and stemming from the title, it becomes ironic, as the stories stray far from the joy depicted in the title. There's nothing joyful about exile, as the term denotes. It entails being forcibly driven out of a place or country. In the short story Waiting, the short story explores both the physical and spiritual realm as the spirit fears reincarnation, and it likens human life to exile. He portrays issues of slavery, colonialism, independence, and exile. The protagonist and narrator of the story is a spirit in waiting, who throughout time chooses potential parents who will bring forth its birth. So the narration spans centuries, as this spirit has witnessed slavery, where his first potential father, Abu, is sold to slave traders. Colonialism, where white people, who are referred to as the pink people, invade African countries and carve out territories for themselves. The spirit has also experienced independence, where his latest potential parents are part of the guerrilla warfare against the colonizers. And lastly, migration or exile, as these parents flee to a country in the West. After waiting for slavery to end, it witnesses colonialism. In one of the passages, it says, "I was in the 6th month of the waiting when tragedy struck. Rumors had been circulating for months that the pink people on the coast were moving inland, disposing chiefs and taking over land and giving it to their followers." So when colonialism ends, the spirit identifies a new set of parents who are involved in the fight against a brutish regime, which forces them to flee the country. Human life for this spirit is exile, as it is rooted in violence and chaos. In the short story Blood Feuds, the story tells us of two families in exile in Zimbabwe who long to return home, but are unable to do so because of the political climate of their home country. The short story explores the question of home and what it means to the exile. Zeleza argues that exile and the exile shares kinship with the emigre, expatriate, emigrant, and refugee. Each of these terms has different moral and legal inflections. The exile is usually seen as a victim of banishment, while the expatriate and the immigrant enjoy some choice, and emigrant and refugee are legal statuses. Exile, however, is a rupture often marked by pain and loss. Even if later the perspectives and experiences of exile, in all their tantalizing or terrifying dualities or pluralities, might come to be prized as a source of creativity, a space for new self-refashioning and literary production. So the exile does not really have a choice, but is forced to flee in fear of persecution or execution. As Karine Mardorosian argues, that exile commonly suggested an unwilled expulsion from a nation, such that no return is possible unless it be under the shadow of imprisonment, execution, or some other coercive physical response. While migrant suggested a relatively voluntary departure with the possibility of return. So at the beginning of the short story Blood Feuds, the protagonist, his father, and his father's friend, known as Uncle Pala, all live in Zimbabwe, where they work as miners and are involved in exile politics from back home. The narrator also tells us that his father denies the term an exile and opts for the term migrant workers. So my father and Uncle Pala never regarded themselves as exiles. That term was reserved for the educated elite, nor did they regard themselves as refugees. Refugees were destitute people, mostly women and children, fleeing war and famine. So they thought of themselves as ordinary migrant workers. They had the freedom to go back home, and that is why the term migrant is preferred in this case. And at the same time, the character's association of the term exile with elitism brings about a problem. So most African exiles were intellectuals who criticized regimes mostly through their writings. And Zeleza points out that exile is a prerequisite to the imagination, a preserve of intellectuals. This is how intellectuals like him connected with home, writing by criticizing the very regime that forced him to leave his home country. So the narrator is faced with the nostalgia of home, a home that has been described as a utopia by his father and uncle, only to realize as they return to their home country, that it is not the home he imagined. But there is still this longing for home, both from the narrator and the parents. The experiences of literal exile for both generations are a mixture of emotional loneliness and nostalgia for home on the one hand, and intellectual detachment from the harsh political realities of home on the other. The country the narrator's father and uncle had fought for is faced with a dictatorial regime which warrants civil unrest, such that exile becomes a safe space for them. The idea of returning home becomes distance, such that exile removed the sting of immediacy. Thus, exile, with all its pain, was also a shield. It was a mask behind which they could dream and hide from themselves and avoid taking complete charge of their lives. So herein lies the irony of the title again. As with the pain experienced in exile, the narrator would rather be in exile than return to a country with political unrest. In School Reunion, Zeleza presents the issue of colonialism and dictatorship, where he portrays a missionary school constructed by the white missionaries, which has now been taken over by the government. The same missionaries who are bringing in Christian education are the same ones involved in sexual abuse scandals. So the moral corruption within the clerical establishment, the supposed bastion of moral purity, negates the validity of that very establishment as custodians of religious and social values. So at the heart of these scandals is Father Louis. Father Louis had always wanted to serve in Africa because of its spiritual and material poverty. The first satisfied the missionary zealot in him, and the second, the ascetic. He was not disappointed. Africa was crying out for salvation. So the students are seen as privileged as they have acquired the white man's colonial education. The students were indeed privileged, for they learned the white man's secrets, his language, history, geography, customs, values, conquests, and triumphs. We see a train of migration where the West is coming into Africa, not to develop Africa, but to claim and take hold of the African. Disguised under the pretense of getting rid of Africa's backward and wretched ways, we see that they become the perpetrators themselves. As if their missionaries' abuse towards the students is not enough, these former students are faced with a totalitarian regime that does not want to taint the country's image. So the regime takes over the school. So the Provisional Revolutionary Democratic Council, or the PRDC, as represented in the short story, is a representation of the Malawi Congress Party under Dr. Hastings Kamuzu-Banda's regime. In the same way the PRDC silences the journalist who's covering this former student's story, is the same way the Banda regime silenced anyone or any organization that tried to publish information the country did not approve of. Longwe, an alumnus of St. Joseph, decides to report on the story of Father Louis's sexual abuse towards the students of St. Joseph, but his plan backfires. Longo's plan backfired. He contacted a journalist and, on the condition of anonymity, told him the story of Father Louis's sexual abuse of students. After a weekend of interviews by the Soul Brothers, as the notorious special branch agents were called, he relented and disclosed his source. In the short story Suspended Dreams, Zeleza in this short story makes direct references to the Banda regime, thereby criticizing his dictatorial regime, as well as criticizing colonialism and its false pretenses of coming to evangelize Africa. So in Suspended Dreams follows the life of a college student and his friend Makala, who experiences the dictatorial regime's silencing and arrests without trial. He narrates that most of the people on campus, and especially lecturers, are picked up on Fridays, as they are usually told about these pickups on Mondays. Because of this, they have turned to silence because the reasons as to why people are picked up are not clear, so it is better not to talk about it. On Mondays, Friday's pickings would be revealed by the registrar. The news would strike one more nail of fear into our already terrified minds, and the clouds of silence over the university would thicken. So a character known as Dr. Juma, a lecturer at the university, also disappears. So Dr. Juma's disappearance is faced with little reaction because the state allows it. This is similar to the case of intellectuals and lecturers at the University of Malawi who were victims of the Banda regime and were detained without trial. A good example is Jack Mapanje, who at the time of his arrest was a member of the English department. Mapanje is one of Malawi's leading poets, detained without charge for almost 4 years between September 1987 and May 1991. Zeleza critiques the Banda regime by highlighting how innocent people were detained without trial and were forced to stay in prisons. At the same time, despite living in this metaphorical state of exile, the narrator also finds himself in literal exile at the end of the short story. On the fourth Monday, after we had thrown the letters out of the window, I returned from my uncle's place to find that Makala had been picked up. That week, I did not wait for Friday. Instead, I left the campus immediately, and a couple of days later, sneaked out of the country. I never completed my studies, I never had my dance with Grace, and I never heard from Makala again. So as an experienced condition, exile expresses the enduring aftermath of political displacement in people's lives, more generally, and the impact of such displacement on political subjectivity, identity, and mobility in particular. So because of the political climate in his country is hostile, exile becomes a safe option for him, leading to the joy referred in the title, that the joy is somewhere else other than his own country. So lastly, and in conclusion, Zeleza examines the way exile can be a metaphorical concept as well as a literal concept. He examines the way Edward Said's writing of exile is an act of healing, remembering, recreating, and returning to the elusive home of his youth. That words and memory are summoned in all their solemn and slippery power, in a heroic act of physical and psychic courage to give meaning to an extraordinary fragmented life, a life permanently out of place, suspended in perpetual exile, which can similarly be applied to his collection. So human life is portrayed as a state of exile in waiting. Exile is seen as a safe space compared to home in blood feuds. And home is presented as this exilic condition in school reunion. And exile is the only option in Suspended Dreams. Thank you so much. Happy birthday, Prof. And I'm honored to have had this opportunity. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gumbwa. We'll switch gears now to our in-person presentations and hear from Dr. Gerald Rizzo from the Afroterra Cartographic Library, whose talk is entitled The 1619 Diaspora, Placing Eyes at the Source.
So I can begin, Dr. Zeleza. I am so grateful to make this short trip from Boston to meet you today. And I also am grateful to be able to link this material online to any of your global students. As we merge together to take a moment of science and to ground it in humanities. Professor Zeleza has consistently inspired us and inspired a charge to cross the barriers of time and space and retrieve the untold presence of Africa, a continent with the greatest proportion of youth, of languages, and of truly momentous migrations. We approach the pedagogy, this type of pedagogy, by introducing the texture of a cartographic library focused on Africa as a lesson companion. I'm trying to advance the slide. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, it advanced. Okay. Yeah. There's a bit of delay on the advance of the slide. Okay. We learned of the Middle Passage as an event, but that place still exists. The purpose now is to open the interior, which has always existed. By 1619, Luanda Sao Paulo, on the coast of Angola, had already become the busiest chattel port ever recorded, and thoroughly documented in the voyage database, listing coastal records of 5 million captives from Central Africa alone, nearly half of the entire Atlantic slave trade. To highlight the case for placement, this Portuguese Fort Massangano, 110 kilometers upstream, is the longest continuous interior depot and thoroughly documented and thoroughly referenced as the focal point for the 20 and odd slaves who were remanded to Jamestown in 1619, marking the advent of a 400-year legacy in the development of North America. In our study of 100 maps during the 100 years before and after 1619, these are the 7 toponyms that gave to the world an awareness of Dongo. We hear names in a swirling rhythm, but what are the eyes doing? Digital access works by gathering the eyes and expanding the immediate senses. Indeed, the sense of connection begins with whereness. From where exactly did the 20 and odd souls reside? The placement is a affirmative piece in the 1619 story. There is ample literature from several historical sources that mention a kingdom of Dongo, but there is so much more in the station and positions of that noble name. It'll take a minute to advance, and we'll have a manuscript to show. In high resolution, we present the three oldest maps on record to bring that space into proximity. Here we can pause together in a rare moment of public reflection. The year is 1645, on site, hand-drawn by a Capuchin missionary. The single word Dongo springs from the page, now realized as an actual inhabited place that existed precisely here. Along the Kwanzaa River, public reflection. "50 years earlier, Filippo Pigafetta had made this first ever published depiction of Central Africa, showing three important features. It identifies Ngaza, later destroyed in a famous mercenary alliance, producing most of the captives negotiated at the time of the 1619 voyage. But the symbol remained on 42% of the maps as a representation of ongoing Dongo resistance, including the upper mark of Mons Quema, or Burnt Rock's position, only appearing in 2% of the maps. But Lago Aqualunda remained the most prominent in 75% of the maps. I was going to go back one, it went two, but there was one additional map which in 1641, the Dutch took control of the region there for a brief 8 years using more advanced cartography. graphically documenting the continued range of Dongo Regis, marked in the rotated font, and also Mons Quema at the top edge. The actual burnt rocks are now photographed here precisely where the site exists at minus 9.6 south and 16.2 degrees east longitude. Next, we used 6 physical marks as exact pins in georeference software to overlay the Dutch map onto modern satellite coordinates. The alignment confirms the triangular location of Dongo between the Kwanza and Lukala rivers, but it finds some other features in error, evident in the burnt rocks in a northerly distortion and the symbolic Lake Aqualunda in a farther easterly distortion, suggesting varied oral renderings for these strategic locations. The symbolic Lake Aqualunda can be re-estimated to a location nearer to 16 degrees longitude using the known hydrologic floodplain. Where we now see a series of hydro dam reservoirs on satellite views. These are located where braided marshes and islands were surveyed during the previous 200 years, plus earlier historical references describing the Kindongo Islands as the defensive position for Dongo. Now, for us, a phenomenal question remains. Why does placement matter? This very act of placement hurls a vector with force and direction. At once, there becomes a capacity, a space to supply context, filled with intersecting paths, origins, migrations, encounters, spanning 400 years and itemized in 10,000 other place names. With a ready tap, every point has surroundings, orbits to take notice of others in history. So next, how does experience happen? The world we know is formed deep within the hippocampus on this functional MRI scan. In recent years, several labs perfected a method to insert thin wires precisely into a single brain cell of animals and humans. This enabled a record of electrical firing while actively roaming on a platform. But surprisingly, the electrical signals were only heard at the moment of specific locations on the roaming grid. With a firm basis in this 2014 Nobel Prize for the discovery of place cells, we know tracing is deeply natural. The observation of terrain becomes a biologic placement directly into the temporal lobe of any curious mind. We also know that eyes can be tracked and paced by technology. Precision oculometry can map the intensity of thought as revealed in eye movements, measuring and tracking each millisecond of time spent on exact spots on a screenscape. As to what is salient, what is ignored, what is automatic, reinforced, or learned. Adding GIS or georeferenced information systems can turn lists into plots and positions as it layers the vital game of matching. Along with OCR, optical character recognition, as a machine that can learn and find a mass of fonts scattered in all directions on an unlimited cache of digitized map sheets. The journey to verify and modify requires repeated comparisons with full access to sort through the historical deceptions. Anyone with a pan and zoom hotspot can now take the full measure of a place. These kinetics are what distinguish spatial activities from other learning methods. The viewers engage at the same time outside the representation and enveloped by it. In conclusion, a proof of concept becomes a call to action. Digital humanities can activate eye movements, register experiences, collaborate disciplines, and finally, achieve outcomes that reach all the way from aptitude to attitude, making a memorable path that thoroughly embodies Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. Our next speaker, Dr. Kayla Harley, will be giving a paper entitled Laissez-faire and the Age of Transformational Black Travel. Kayla Harley's from the Beebody Marketplace.
Habaragani, good afternoon. There is more than one way to tell a story or to present. So I will begin with a song. Tech is supporting us, so I'm going to be patient with them and let them bring the images up. Tuwe, barima, tuwe. Tuwe, barima, tuwe. Abafraba, awa, dawa, tuwe. Abafraba, awa, dawa, tuwe. Hey, barima, tuwe. Hey, barima, tuwe. Hey, barima, tuwe. Yes. Yes. So in the spirit of Ubuntu, I wanted to welcome us in with something synergizing because that's who we are. We are energy, we are spirit, we are dynamic. We can advance to the next slide. So I present to you this afternoon Laissez-faire, the age of transformational African diasporic and or Black travel. And yes, my name is Kayla Hartley. Laissez-faire is a French term. It simply means to let the people do. It's also synonymous with being nonchalant or just the essence of being, similar to what Latin America would call que sera, sera. We can advance to the next slide. So today is a celebration of life. Happy birthday to Professor Zeleza. Thank you so much for having me to Howard University Center of African Studies. This is incredible to be here. And, you know, I would say for me, what is so intriguing about Professor Zeleza's work and his writings and his legacy really is the edification of the African peoples, the upliftment of his writing, although scholarly, and his ability to continue to challenge us with the notions that we have decided to be African in essence, in fact, and in truth. Always to be evolving and to being in an ongoing state of becoming. This quote here: one critical observation of the diaspora's current condition is one of self-conscious identity, which lies in remembering, imagining, and engaging with the original homeland. We advance to the next slide. So now that we know why we're here, I want to tell you a little bit about me. So I am a Pan-Africanist by way of lineage, heritage, culture, my personal interest in spirit, and so on. I am a culturalist. I am a scholar, an educator, a global citizen, a certified somatic healing practitioner, therapist, travel enthusiast, entrepreneur, community builder, dancer, writer, seeker, and preservationist. These are parts of me that I will share with you, but I wanted to share images to begin with. We advance. So why this? Why now? The objective of my submission is the anthropological study which demonstrates how African diasporic travel can be viewed and approached as a means of rest, reprieve, and to address the ever-prevailing mental health and identity crisis plaguing communities of color today. We advance. So, President Vincent said yesterday, Howard University is the Mecca. Welcome to the Mecca. And I would say at one point in the early 19th century, the United States of America was called the land of milk and honey. It was seen as this promised land of hope and opportunity for a bright future. But what we get to realize is that this generation is starting to embrace a more realized truth that although that might have been for our grandparents and parents, our experience is very different. So there are many reasons why persons may travel: for migration, opportunity, and hope. Maybe you're a refugee by way of circumstance or forced. Now this evolution of travel is moving into autonomy, curiosity, interest, intent, and purpose. It could also be that you have an assignment for work, or maybe you've been enlisted by the military. And then I wanted to put this very important one, the unknown, the ethereal, which is a serendipitous approach, not always knowing, but a spiritual calling. Again, it goes back to Zeleza's work about imagining and embodiment and being in the presence of. We advance. Okay, so radical rest and freedom. What we're finding in travel is, as I mentioned, our grandparents and parents had a different guidance, a different North Star. But what they didn't realize is they were also bringing their burdens, their past grievances, struggle, and pain. This is evident in the millennial, because we're now seeing that new parents aren't teaching their children indigenous language. They're not upkeeping with culture as much. They are removed from traditional foods and ways and life of being, just again by way of circumstance, not having that connection. The experience now is of what I call the weight of American imperialist complex, which is simply capitalism, which is simply the pursuit of excellence to the point of exhaustion, which is simply the pursuit of global dominance, which is what the United States is known for doing. As a result, we're experiencing a desensitization of the soul. We're experiencing a separation from the senses. And we're also, there's a shrouding, right? There's a hiding, the hidden of plain truths, which is again, that we are in crises. The mental health state, anxiety, depression, fatigue, grief, and the topic that many of us do not like to address, especially in the Black and African community, suicide, which is starting to affect us as young as ages 11. We advance. Oh, too quick. Oh, uh-oh. Okay, stay right there. So what we are now experiencing through this transformation is, again, a going home, Sankofa, remembering to go forward. These are two pillars, and there are more, but from my experience, that are doing a great job of this in 2025. Lawrence Phillips, the founder of Green Book Global, has an app that can actually monetize and help travelers to monetize their experience by sharing reviews, by sharing places that may not be safe, known as what was originally pulled from the Green Book manual during the Jim Crow era, sundown towns, where Black persons can avoid spaces where they are not welcome and could even potentially be in danger. Another pillar is A Traveling Black Woman, founded by Nadine Duncan, formerly a teacher, now sharing her experiences, inviting others to do so as well as they are traveling throughout the diaspora, whether it's to Tanzania or to Ghana, whether it's to South Africa, whether it's to Barbados or to the Bahamas, whether it's to the Galapagos Islands or wherever travels may take us. There is a space and there is a place as part of what is known as knowledge networks that we now have. So I want to just quickly present to you stats and facts about what the relationship to travel is like. So we've got baby boomers, we've got millennials, and I'm sneaking Gen X in there as well with Gen Z. And we're finding that baby boomers are less likely to travel just for rest and relaxation. They must have a purpose, whether this is for family, bringing home goods, or doing something, while millennials and Gen Z are more likely to travel just because, spontaneously, maybe within a week, just pick up their phone and book a hotel or a flight because they're overwhelmed and they need a getaway. We're finding that Gen Z and millennials are also more likely not to wait for the funds to be there, while baby boomers will wait until their one-time vacation to allocate those funds to get away. We are taking more risks, and we are also prioritizing experiences, I would say both fortunately and unfortunately, over starting families, over building, over acquiring land or a house. However, that is changing through diasporic travel. Talk about that. I'm going to move past this for the sake of time. So the collective interest in travel is what? The collective interest in travel is a number of things. So we're starting to see younger generations tapping into money, greater salaries sooner, earlier, coming out of graduate school, coming out of postdoctorates programming, and they're saying yes to travel. They want to have an experience of what I call the great I am. It's a reclamation of identity. It's a going home. It's a remembering. They want to have a sensory experience. They want to smell the food. They want to hear the music. They want to know that it's 5 a.m. and it's time to rise and start the day because the crow is, right? They want to have an experience. They want their souls to be awakened once again. They want to feel like they are home. And we know we can do this in groups and networks that we have here in the West. However, it's just not the same. I actually just got back from Trinidad and Tobago, and I went for 2 weeks just to rest. Again, this idea of rest and reprieve. Huh? Yeah, I know, right? What kind of rest, right? It's very vibrant. And Tobago. But it's good for the mental health because you're getting that balance that you need of being here and then going and being there. You're also getting a catharsis, a release, spiritual engagement. Again, a chance to just be. We know that the systems are not as fast over there as they are here, so we can really drop in and be present. That's such a gift. Let's see, for the sake of time, let's advance. Oh, I will read this quote. When I was in Africa, my soul was at peace, and my energy was always full of happiness, Howson said. I was able to get rid of my bad anxiety and be able to focus on myself, just being a human being, pulled from Travel Noir. We're also hearing a number of millennials speak on their worthiness, their excitement when they're going to the homeland, knowing that they can afford to live there or afford to invest there. Whereas here, we know what it's like to purchase real estate. It's a challenge. It's a struggle, especially if you're doing it on your own or if your parents were not educated or you do not have access to funding or support. And as we know, programs for funding are being stripped away for reasons of which I'm not going into detail about, but you know. All right, let's advance. Okay, so I want to present this to you all because typically when we think about having a catharsis experience, that's an effeminate thing. Women going on their girls' trip, having fun. But these are clear case in point examples of Black and African diasporic men who are choosing travel for release. Case in point, a young man who is an entrepreneur and works in the ministry, in the green there, went to St. Vincent, and that's his first time experiencing natural mineral water. It was incredible, cleansing his face, cleansing his soul, drinking the water. Above, this is a gentleman who left his corporate job in finance to become a travel guide. He actually was my travel guide, explaining that guava leaves are rich in fiber, and you can use this to alleviate stomach pains. You have a gentleman in the center who is a celebrity. He's a singer-songwriter, and he is doing archery to, again, have that balance. And an older gentleman who lives in New York who is a martial artist and who's demonstrating and sharing his work. Black boy joy. It's just, I know we got men in here, but that's a term. We advance. So my personal interest in travel has a lot to do with purpose. I'm going to breeze through this as best. Advance, all right. So much of my endeavors as a scholar at large are self-funded. I just feel called. Essence is what I take from Grenada. This is a retreat that I curated. I brought whomever wanted to come, men and women, and this was the belly dance. So, more belly for Grenada, more belly for Grenada, more belly drama roll. So we learned the song, we learned the dance, we were able to reclaim identity once again by moving your hips to claim life. vitality, and energy. This is something that someone who's dealing with depression and anxiety would need. We advance. Kenya was innovative, exciting, magical, and full of hope. I spoke with these young people who knew more about technology than me, and they were 7, 12, and 14. This is Mzekobe, a tortoise who reminded me in hard times to be patient, to move slow. Again, a remedy for being overwhelmed. We advance. Jamaica, self-awareness and sovereignty. We know the esteemed Zora Neale Hurston, her writings in I Love Myself When I'm Laughing speaks about her experience with the Maroon tribe in Jamaica, how self-sustained they were, how strong they were. This gentleman did a movement practice with me. He was imprisoned for many years. He taught me stillness, embodying patience and stillness, even though we were in practice together. And then, of course, nature. This tree is ancient. We advance. South Carolina, right here at the Penn Center, I recently partook in the Pan-African Screenwriters Retreat. Many people may not know, but it was this location that Martin Luther King started the I Have a Dream speech. They actually started to build a house for him because he loved retreating there so much. So how much gratifying is that we have a part of him through the Penn Center, and we can do the same thing. We can retreat, travel, and have that clear mind to write and become. We advance. Wrapping up here. Resilience in St. Croix. After Hurricane Maria, myself and the community sent clothing, materials to support their ongoing higher education in dance when they wanted to give up. During COVID, I decided to go and teach a workshop, and I was pleased to see that the students are still indeed continuing their education. We advance. And finally, my personal experience with the catharsis, which is recently. This is in Tobago. An organization called Healing with Horses allowed for me to experience what so many people can actually do. If you're dealing with trauma and things that you've embodied, you can actually ride a horse. So I rode one horse, a full fleet of 9 horses followed for about 3 miles along the beach into town and walked them home. This was all spiritually charged. Never been on a horse before. As you can see, I am not riding with a saddle. However, because as a somatic practitioner, I understand breath work and embodiment. I was able to transfer my understanding and knowing of working with people in therapeutic settings to horses. They're not much different than we are. So finally, what is the global impact of transformational Black travel, diasporic Black travel? It is my personal opinion that we as African people should be the largest stakeholders of land acquisition in Africa. It is my opinion that we should support travel because it increases the family, it increases the likelihood and strength and continuity of the family structure. Right now we're seeing a decline in persons wanting to start families because of the low morale, because of that lack of African pride and that lack of presence, that feeling of not belonging, uncertainty, and again, fear due to the climate of political climate, I should say. And then finally, I'll wrap up with adventure. We all should feel revitalized through adventure. It does bring about clarity and propels future innovations and ideas. Thank you all so much.
Okay, thank you, audience. We have just a couple more speakers, and we'll ask them in the interest of time to keep their presentations concise. And sadly, we may not have much time for Q&A, but hopefully we can have a conversation after the panel resolves. So our next speaker is Barakisu Isaka. We're presenting alone? Okay. On behalf of a group of researchers, and the paper is Challenging Stereotypes and Building Bridges, Exploring Racial Narratives Between Africans, African Americans, and Caribbean Scholars in the United States and Africa.
The slides. Yeah. I was about to start dancing whilst we are waiting my slides since Kayla sang for us, but the slides are up, so I'll just get right into it. All right, so our research is titled Challenging Stereotypes and Building Bridges, exploring racial narratives between Africans, African Americans, and West Indians. And my co-authors on this paper were Dennis Trotman, Isaac Kalumbu, and Jose Jackson Malete, and both Isaac and Jose are here. All right, next slide. Oh, I need to use this. All right, I'll just go off before the slide comes up. So various scholars specializing in Black and African studies have conducted extensive research, shedding light on the shared history, identities, struggles, and differences of Native Africans and Africans in the diaspora. Africans in the diaspora includes people of African descent who are globally linked through histories of forced displacement, colonization, and resistance. And this includes African Americans, Africans who are back home, Africans who are here or who are out of Africa, as well as people from the West Indies. And West Indians primarily refer to individuals from the Caribbean region, including Jamaicans, Trinidad, people from Trinidad and Guyana, who share a common history of British colonization and English language usage. Due to the shared histories and identities of these individuals, several African scholars and other Black scholars have highlighted the need for these individuals to come together. For instance, Kwame promoted the idea of one people, which includes envisioning a unified identity for Africans, African Americans, and the Caribbean populations. Despite the call for this unified front, there are deeply rooted divisions and stereotypes that persist among these individuals, which mostly prevents them from getting together. Just to mention, stereotypes are socially constructed beliefs that simplify or group individuals into, or generalize individuals, and sometimes it leads to distortion of identities. Next slide. Stereotypes can be implicit, which is people can acquire it right from childhood, or it can also be reinforced through media and education. Several scholars have highlighted the various stereotypes that exist between this group of individuals that I mentioned earlier on. For instance, Adeyemo in his study highlighted how Yoruba Nigerians in the US stereotyped African Americans as criminals and unmotivated. Similarly, Chore also found in his study that African students view African Americans as culturally disconnected. There are several studies that have touched on this. However, most of these studies have primarily focused on US college students, and there are a few studies that have focused on African professionals, such as professors, and also a few studies have engaged in dialogues between the three groups. Hence, the purpose of this research, next slide, the purpose of this research was to bridge that gap by examining how historical, cultural, and media influences shape mutual stereotypes among these groups, also identify the causes of these stereotypes, and most importantly, identify solutions, because from previous studies, we realized most studies just focus on identifying the problems without identifying solutions. Next slide. All right, so we looked at certain parts of this study, mostly the effect through the social identity theory. The social identity theory posits that people aim to derive self-esteem after comparing their in-group with other out-groups. Now, in the process of the comparison, if there's a negative attribution to one's group, it's more likely to lead to an identity threat. So for our study, we looked at how some of these stereotypes can lead to identity threats. So that was the reason why we looked at this through this theoretical lens. All right, next slide, please. So based on the theory and the purpose of our research, we came up with these 4 research questions. The first being identifying the perceptions that each of these groups have about each other, identifying the root causes, and identifying the effect, and finally, identifying the solutions. Next slide, please. So we utilized a methodological approach called the communicative methodology approach. So as opposed to conducting, let's say, in-depth interviews or focus group interviews, we decided to use a dialogue approach. And the communicative methodology approach focuses on dialogue, so it highlights the direct participation of the people involved. So this is where you are interviewing the people that you are studying. It also moves from identifying problems to solving problems during the research process. With this, this study included college professors and professionals, and it's included 5 facilitated Zoom dialogues. Next slide, please. So we conducted a thematic analysis for this process, and I'm not going to go into details with that, so we can move to the next slide. So based on our thematic, next slide, please. All right, so based on our thematic analysis, our first research questions was focused on identifying the perceptions that African Americans, Africans, and West Indians have about each other. And we identified 2 main overarching themes that had various sub-themes under it. And the first one was negative stereotypes. So just like previous studies reported, we realized that these individuals had negative stereotypes about each group. And some of the sub-themes that we identified under the negative stereotypes was lazy, criminals, relationship difficulties, scam and deception, unpleasant odors, superiority feeling, poverty and punctuality, spirituality, colorism, and skin color stereotypes. Now, each of these sub-themes are related to different groups. Some were for maybe more than one group, but each are related to different groups. But for the sake of time, I can't go through which ones are related, but I'll just highlight some of the quotes that would kind of give you an idea of which of those sub-themes were referring to which group. So some of the quotes that we identified or that came up from the participants were, I have heard that African Americans are too lazy to take care of their children. So this pertains to the stereotype that these other groups have about African Americans, that they are lazy. The other one was African Americans are violent and things. I remember my first trip to the US. I was about 20 and I visited a friend who was studying in St. Louis. And we went to this shopping mall. There were a lot of African Americans, and I felt really unsafe. And this person is highlighting that this is due to the negative stereotype that they have or they've learned about this group, that they are violent. The second one says, if I'm looking for a school for my child, I sometimes feel more comfortable if there are more white people in the school than black people because of the history that black schools were poorly resourced and had bad teachers. Some of the other quotes, especially these quotes, pertains to how African Americans view Africans and other blacks. One of the stereotypes that I've heard about blacks from other parts of the world is that two things. One, they are shady, and that means that they are trying to scam you or trick you into something. Even now, I get emails from a Nigerian prince that needs to transfer 56 million or something. So this pertains to stereotypes of seeing Africans as scammers and some of those other stereotypes that we all hear, either from the media or elsewhere. Someone said they smell funny. This was very surprising to me, but anyway. Someone said they smell funny. These are things I have heard and experienced in my life. Another person also mentioned that when I was in college, I went to a small liberal arts school, and there were 12 black students, including 8 Africans. I have always been proud of my African heritage, but I got the impression that African students thought they were better. So this has to do with the issue of superiority, where African Americans and other blacks perceive Africans from back home as people who think they are superior to other blacks. Then this other quote says, I've heard that Haitians are demonic worshippers through voodoo. So this has to do with stereotypes that persist with West Indians or people from the West Indies. And there's one other quote that also relates to people from the West Indies, says that I heard on the issue of skin color, it's being viewed in Jamaica as a benefit. All right, so next slide. However, despite the negative stereotypes that came up during the dialogues among these groups, there were also some positive stereotypes. So these individuals also have positive stereotypes about various groups. So some of the positive stereotypes that came up in relation to African Americans were innovators, cultural icons, where Africans as well as people from the West Indies believe that African Americans contributed to a lot of innovations in the US. The other positive stereotypes that came up pertaining to Africans was that they are hospitable and collaborative, and with West Indians, they are friendly and connected to their roots. So just to highlight one quote for the sake of time, one person said, just to add to knowledge as well, is when I learned about all the interventions in this country that make life quite comfortable. That meant, from everything from the gas masks to the traffic lights and many more, that they came from African Americans. So those are some of the positive stereotypes that people know. Now we decided to look at what are the root causes of these stereotypes. Where are people learning these negative and positive stereotypes about each other from? And the first thing that came up, or one of the overarching themes, was media influence. So here people highlighted how these the portrayals by the media, what they see in the TV and the news contribute to some of what they know about these various groups. The other one had to do with institutional indoctrination, where some of the individuals highlighted how the institutions actually teach people some of these negative stereotypes. So just to mention some quotes pertaining to this, someone says, these are some of the terms that I've heard or seen on TV. I think it's the media. The media is the most important role that had to play with some of these stereotypes. Someone says, what I knew about Africa was really from the media and in my textbook. As related to the institutional and indoctrination, someone says, I believe we bring a lot of baggage to transdiasporic encounters, and the baggage is made up of centuries-long indoctrination from our home countries and communities, attitudes and beliefs about diasporic ideas that emanate from colonial and anti-Black hegemonic institutions that we've all come through. So this highlights how people believe these stereotypes emerge from institutional indoctrination. Now we decided to look at the effects of some of these stereotypes, so holding either negative or positive stereotypes about a particular group of individuals. What are some of the effects? And the most important thing that came up was lack of engagement with each other. Next slide. Was lack of engagement with each other. So here, a lot of them, all three groups, I highlighted how they stay away from each other and do not engage with each other because of the stereotypes that they have about each other. So just to highlight some quotes, one participant said, and I remember my sophomore year going up to one of the young ladies, and it turned out she thought the same thing, that we thought we were better. These were stereotypes that were really designed to keep us apart, to separate us. Another person says, some of them told me at that time they had been warned by their families, and that when they came to the US, the Black folks to stay away from the Black folks. Someone also says, I've also seen that students come and try to move away from being seen as just as a Black person. And one of the factors that has to do with identity threats, the theory highlights that when individuals are faced with identity threats, they develop a coping mechanism. And one of the coping mechanisms they develop is to disassociate themselves from the in-group. So this is something that we are seeing in this instance, where people would not want to associate with other Blacks because of the negatives that are attached to them. Again, the main focus of this study and the additional factor that this study adds to existing literature is providing solutions. So although we highlighted the problems, the root causes and the effect, we also asked participants to offer solutions that can help fix these issues of both media stereotypes as well as stereotypes that are learned from other sources. And the first theme under this was education and awareness. Next slide, please. Was education and awareness. We also had cultural understanding. We had racial healing and unity. And we also had encouraging dialogue. So just to highlight some quotes under this as well, a participant highlighted, a part of my career is really dedicated to dismantling stereotypical perspectives. So this focuses on the issue of education and also creating awareness. As regards to the issue of cultural understanding or cultural exchange, someone highlighted that beyond the academic, we should capitalize on personal relationships by visiting people, going to churches, barbecuing together, doing it openly. They also highlighted that that can create a space for cross-cultural truth-telling. So creating spaces where, such as this dialogue that happened between the professionals, where people can share their truth and learn from each other. So just to conclude, our research found that stereotypes are indeed sustained by media portrayals, and also colonial narratives and institutional indoctrination contributes to that. We also saw that, as found by previous literature, there are indeed negative stereotypes that persist amongst these groups. However, our research added that there are also positive stereotypes that these groups have about each other. These misperceptions contribute to social identity threats, and that can discourage cross-group solidarity, where we saw that people would not like to engage with each other. Some of the practical aspect that we would highlight from our study is that beyond critiquing harmful portrayals, we must create and amplify our own stories. So it's easier to say, because the media contribute to these negative stereotypes, we are going to critique the media, but how are we contributing to putting our own positive aspect of our stories on these media platforms? We should also promote inclusive education. That's how we can get to learn about each other in the more accurate and positive way. Encourage intergroup dialogue and healing circles in both community and academic spaces. So thank you.
We'll next hear from our very own Dr. Mcia Clark, Hip Hop Studies and the Decolonization of African Studies.
Do I have a clicker, or? Is there a clicker I should have, or is it? Okay, try what now? I see nothing. Is there something? Is there like a?
Oh, okay.
Okay. So maybe I can just, I don't have a lot of slides, so I can just tell them if that works. So I do want to start by saying, yesterday was a really full circle moment for me, seeing our first and second year African Studies students speak on this stage, because it kind of took me back to when I was a second year student in the African Studies department and went to the 2002 Codesria General Assembly in Kampala, where I first met Dr. Zeleza. So I was a second year student in the program, coming here after getting my MA at American University, where one class taught us that there was no real African feminist movement, didn't exist. The other class taught us that yes, there's an African intelligentsia, but they all live outside of Africa. So landing in Kampala and like literally seeing the giants in the field, people whose work I didn't know about. So hearing these things as an MA student, knowing that it's not true, but not having the language or the understanding to fight it. And it's one of the reasons why for one of my classes, I did a paper on African feminism, because I'm like, no, this is not risking a C, but it was fine because I had to prove a point. So landing in Kampala, seeing Zeleza, seeing Mamdani, Amina Mama, seeing all of these individuals whose work would profoundly shape my career. So then yesterday, seeing our students and thinking that while we write all these articles and books, the real kind of test of our work is in its impact with future generations. And very few of us can say that we have birthed generations of scholars. So it was just really important for me to say that after kind of sitting there and watching them and remembering when I was at that stage in my career. So having a degree in African Studies, later on kind of really like going into hip hop studies. So the images I'm gonna share are really African Studies students at Howard who are either also studying hip hop or who have gone on to graduate and do kind of really important things in hip hop studies. So looking at hip hop studies and African studies, You have both are interdisciplinary fields that are concerned with the study of people of African descent. They've both been influenced by other disciplines. They both have different histories. So African studies, of course, began earlier, and it has these kind of roots with the Cold War, European so-called exceptionalism, while hip hop studies emerged later and really kind of from an anti-racist, post-colonial Black feminist thought framework. So hip hop studies learned quite a few lessons from other disciplines as well as from African studies and African American studies. Next slide, please. So as I'm looking at and was asked to reflect on the work of Dr. Zeleza, of course, my own work, as I said, has been influenced by his. And so kind of looking at the decolonization mandate, this idea of decolonizing African studies, which we've been talking about for a very long time. And I know with Zeleza's work, he's talked a lot about the proliferation of academic institutions in Africa, the growth of African and African American studies in the West, and the call to decolonize. Understanding that the research and scholarship and the curriculum and discourse were problematic, and that there was a need to, in fact, decolonize, and that included decentering Eurocentric epistemologies, really kind of challenging this idea of European exceptionalism, viewing Africa through a Eurocentric lens or framing, but also addressing connections to racism and neo-imperialism in our research. Next slide, please. So then looking at that and then looking at later, next slide, the emergence of hip hop studies, which emerged, like I said, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and you've got several scholars, Jeff Chang, Cheryl Keyes, Murray Foreman, Mark Anthony Neal, several people. And the image is Toni Blackman, who was a student at Howard, who went into hip hop studies more as a practitioner, but she kind of became a hip hop ambassador for the State Department, traveled throughout the continent, and and has done quite a bit. So, yeah, so we gotta, keep it moving, Okay, so you have these early scholars who were heavily involved in shaping hip hop studies, which is grounded in hip hop culture and kind of being accountable to the community. So, those of us who are publishing in hip hop studies understand it's not just the academy we have to appease, we also have to appease hip hop communities. Hip hop culture will call you out if you produce something or publish something that's problematic. I've seen it done a few times. And so one of the things that hip hop studies has done is really kind of deal with ethnographic fieldwork, provide like frameworks for it, kind of having more of a participatory approach to research and practitioner-led methods. James Spady, who coined the term hip-hopography, would become kind of one of the leading scholars in hip-hop studies. Next slide, please. And so looking at anti-imperialist methods in practice, these are prerequisites, not goals. So whereas when we talk about decolonizing African studies, we're often talking about goals. There are things that we're still challenging. I mean, we've seen that a couple years ago out of the, was it Wisconsin University? Person who wrote the book or wrote that article on Zanzibari women, which was problematic. So we're still fighting these things. Within hip hop studies, I can tell you about it later. Within hip hop studies, these are things that, in terms of the doing anti-imperialist work, again, is a prerequisite for getting recognition in the field. This is not something that's a goal. So when we look at ethnography, interviews, participant observation, the ways in which we do those things are, we don't just kind of see participants as subjects. Citational justice, citing African scholarship as well as non-academic knowledge, recognizing that. Consent, the whole idea of consent forms are problematic. So understanding that you form relationships in the communities that you're doing research, that it's not just bureaucracy, that you're not owed anything, that you have to create a relationship that is based on not you, the researcher, and this person, the so-called subject, kind of dismantling. So hip-hopography really dismantles that whole hierarchy between the community and the researcher, which needs to be destroyed. Next slide. And so within hip-hopography, you have this idea of ground-up epistemologies. You have this, again, horizontal research or community dynamics. It's not a hierarchy. It's a partnership. Practitioners and the folks that you're working with are participants, and collaborators are not subjects, so even calling them subjects is problematic. Looking at so-called academic sources and giving them legitimacy, music and lyrics as valid sources and practitioner-authored chapters. So a lot of hip-hop studies scholars will co-author works with hip-hop artists. Some of the foundational work in hip-hop studies has been co-authored or includes contributions by artists. And so all of these things, when you look at kind of hip-hopography and the whole meaning behind doing research, I think it's important to kind of look, these are things that are just part of the framework of hip-hop studies. Next slide, please. So when I look at Dr. Zeleza and hip-hop studies, there is a shared vision. The decolonizing African studies, hip-hop studies very much share vision. It is a critique of Eurocentric paradigms and the imperialist roots of African studies. There is an advocacy of epistemic justice and inclusive methodologies. There is the call for promoting agency and diasporic perspectives. There is an advocacy for Pan-African intellectual solidarity. So hip-hop studies models what we envision for the field of African studies. So I did an article talking about this, and I think one of the reviewers said, well, there is that in in African studies. I'm like, yeah, but that is hip-hop studies. Like, this is a part of African studies, sure, but hip-hop studies, the foundation of it is anti-imperialist. Whereas African studies, again, this is a goal, this is something that we're trying to achieve. Next slide. So when we look at the relationship between hip-hop and African studies, the question always comes, well, hip hop is music. What does that have to do with, and especially a lot, even this conference, the culture stuff kind of comes in at this point. I know we, in a department of privilege, policy and, the international relations and all that stuff, which is very important, obviously. But when we look at hip hop studies and African studies, looking at religion, the role of religion in society, these questions around Islam and hip hop, where in Senegal, Islam and hip hop are very much connected, whereas in East Africa and Tanzania, we're still having these debates on whether or not hip hop is haram in the Islamic context. So those are things that are happening within hip hop. Democracy, I think Yenamar and Balai Citoyen were two events, and the Arab Spring in North Africa, that really helped within African studies people see the legitimacy and the relevance, because you had hip hop artists that played critical roles in all three of those movements. And so I think we saw, okay, here's this line between hip hop and elections and registering people to vote and challenging constitutional change. Feminisms, when it comes to Black feminism, definitely kind of gave rise to hip hop feminism, which criticized the respectability politics in Black feminism. We see the same thing with African hip hop women who will criticize the respectability politics that is in African feminism. But when we look at the music that these women are producing, the average young woman on the continent of Africa, is her first exposure to feminist ideas is through the music. It is not through some article I wrote. Like, she may not ever read that in her life. But she's going to hear the music of these artists that are challenging patriarchy, that are challenging ideas of who women should be, that are, kind of presenting different ideas of sexuality and gender identity. So these artists are contributing to African feminist thought. Migration, when we look at migration experiences and identities and ties to home, artists are speaking about that, whether it's artists like DJ Wadi from Senegal talking about those who are taking the boats to Europe or trying to go across the Sahara, or artists like Bliss the Ambassador talking about trying to get a visa at the US Embassy and the politics there, and coming here and realizing it is not the land of milk and honey, that, back in the day, trying to scratch off the phone cards, saying it says 90 minutes and you really only got 20, but there's nothing you can do about it. So all of these things that are expressed in the music, so we want to know, okay, what is the African immigrant experience? One source of that is through the music of these artists. Language. One of the things I think is amazing is, we have the debate on what language should you write in. The debate between Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that's happening now within hip hop. It's looks different in different countries. So whereas in Tanzania, the industry has been very much pro-Swahili. Swahili is a language, the national language, the official language. If you're an artist that doesn't perform in Swahili, you probably won't get played on the radio. Go to South Africa, you've got kind of this multilingual, space. Artists that perform in English, there's no kind of discrimination against those artists. So you're having these conversations that are happening. And so when we look at kind of the relationship between hip hop studies and African studies, there is, really good reason to, look at the lens or the methodologies used in hip hop studies. Next slide. Oh, also sorry. Okay, so that previous slide, if you didn't, thank you. So hip hop studies is a minor that was just approved at Howard, and so we are doing our third hip hop conference. One of my mandates is to really make sure, hip hop studies has gone global. I mean, I'm not the first person to write about hip hop in Africa, but I feel like for myself, it's really important that African artists, the experiences of African artists in the diaspora are represented. So we've really been trying to, get more folks who are doing international stuff. So if you're going to be here in November, we're doing the conference. We haven't sent out the call for papers, but it will be here. Okay, last slide. So the artist there is Shiraq, who is an artist. She went to Howard. She actually studied Swahili while she was at Howard. Now is a huge artist on the underground scene. She did a concert here. We took students to see her. It was really amazing. But I also wanted to show, while we're talking about decolonizing African studies and the work of Dr. Zeleza, and we're talking about hip hop studies, his work has also been impactful in hip hop studies. So these are just some of the scholars who have cited Dr. Zeleza in their work. All of them are not African studies scholars. So Travis Harris, whose article, Can It Be Bigger Than Hip Hop? From Global Hip Hop Studies to Hip Hop, is not an African studies scholar who cited the work of Dr. Zeleza. Rochelle Peck, that she's dealing with Nairobi. There were a couple others, and I may not have put them in here, beyond Christian hip hop. So that one also cites. So everything here cites Zeleza, and these are just some of the works. Of course, those of us who do work on hip hop in Africa, his work has definitely been hugely influential and has been cited, but I wanted to kind of bring that out to show the work that we're talking about in terms of decolonizing African studies. That work has also been impactful in hip hop studies, where again, that is kind of the framework of that field of study. And so when you're looking for stuff to cite, as hip hop studies emerges, you're looking to cite the scholars whose framework already kind of expresses that, including the work of Dr. Zeleza. And that's it, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you for being such an engaged and patient audience. Our final paper will be from Dr. Lepete Malete from Michigan State University, Sport, Youth Empowerment, and Sustainable Development, a Pan-African Perspective.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, while they're keying up the slides, why don't you stand up for a second? You've been sitting a lot for the whole afternoon. So just stretch your arms out, go to the side, and go to the side a little bit, and so on and so forth. Okay, while you are at it, let's actually give a round of applause. Let's give it up for the men. Let's also give it up for a giant among giants. Where's Cassandra? Let's give it up for Cassandra. All right, you can have a seat. So we we are standing on the shoulders of giants. The last 2 days, including today, of course, we call it, we have been hearing a lot about Paul Zeleza's work. It is incredible to really appreciate how a scholar can dedicate their time to different fields. He's a historian, an economic historian, and then he goes on to talk about, include different disciplines. So Paul, I won't disclose what Isaac and I talked about recently, or today, about what we should do in the future. I'll let him do that, but I think we need to continue this. Specifically because I would like to see physicists here. I want to see our, people in chemistry and, in biochemistry and the science fields and the natural sciences and so on and so forth at a meeting like this, where we can infuse African scholarship, African paradigms into the study of science so that we know how that goes. I feel honored to be part of this group and this conference, specifically because I have been to many conferences. I've been around studying sports and exercise sciences, particularly in the area of sports psychology, which is my major. I moved from history and English, similar background as Paul from the University of Botswana, and then moved into this discipline because it intrigued me, and it has been my profession. I've been following for quite a while. But it is actually the foundation of African scholarship, the Pan-Africanist, that actually laid the basis for who I am and for many of us. And I'm thinking here about the works of Sembe and Usman, the works of Marcus Garvey and others, and also reading the works of people like Ngugi, I'll marry one I want, or Aikwe Ama, the beautiful ones are not yet born. We have to be thinking, hey, have they been born yet? I think they have been. So we need to be moving, and we need to move forward. All right, move to the next slide. So I'm going to share with you the context within which we are dealing with in the area of sports, sport and exercise science, recreational studies, and why they are very important. The importance of higher education has been mentioned in this conference and repeated quite many times during the last 2 days. We know that there's a slow prioritization of sport and exercise sciences, as well as leisure studies in higher education in Africa. For me to study this, I had to leave Botswana. And outside of South Africa, there are not many universities that are offering this kind of stuff in their schools. Nigeria has been doing well. Ghana now has a new program that I think a colleague of mine and others have been developing. And you have other universities like Cape Coast that are actually coming up. So this is an area that is neglected. But its role in terms of fostering skills development, especially of young people, social cohesion, as well as economic transformation is immense. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show something about what I'm talking about. Now, here we have the microeconomic effects of sport and recreation and leisure studies on the global economy. Look at those numbers. Now, the global sport and recreation market was projected in 2025, in 2022 to be about, what, 501 billion, and now it is projected in 2026 to be about 206 billion, all right? And then in those numbers, we're talking about billions of dollars, all right? Only Egypt and South Africa are mentioned. Where's the rest of Africa in this? So we need to be taking interest in these numbers. Now, if you look at the graph to the left, you're going to see that here we have, for instance, recreation, culture, and whatever. You cannot see from where you are. We have education. And then we also have another area which has to do with hotel and hospitality. Those three by themselves are especially what we are talking about, higher education, recreation, and sport management. The impact of this in the European economy alone and why nations invest in it. Let's move to the next slide. I want to also demonstrate what's going on. This is very small. You will not see from where you are. But the importance of this slide, which actually is taken, I got this from an article with reference, of course, by these two scholars. It shows global research and economic impacts of sport and leisure economy. How much research is being done? While Africa is not doing as much as it's supposed to do, even globally, there's very little going on. Here we are, we have about 50 articles that are studying the global economic impact of sport. And that should be, it should be much more serious like that. If you think about Washington, where we are sitting, Washington, D.C. alone, the number of sports teams and industries or recreation and leisure industries that are in billions of dollars. Shouldn't be interested in this. Let's move to the next slide. So I'm actually engaging in a conversation with you and say, walk with me here to appreciate what I'm talking about. We do not understand what this is, and we are not curious enough. But I'm very grateful to Paul and Cassandra for having created a platform and a space for this in their scholarship. That's how visionary they are. Let's move to the next slide, please. All right? So, okay, are you there? I probably could just have a conversation. Right, so, again, I'm talking about the challenges and opportunities of higher education that African higher education can capitalize on. Limited institutional investment in sport policy, support, as well as the cultural perceptions and values attached to sport and sports industries and leisure studies, including opportunities for growth. This is what I'm saying, that it's going to be important to develop these interdisciplinary approaches, build on the spirit and the ideals that Paul and Cassandra and their team have actually thought about. Leveraging international partnerships and strengthening research and training and outreach. Next slide, please. So it's very, very important to think along these lines that this is a clarion call for bolder action, and that bolder action means we need to take interest in these issues. So what I'm going to demonstrate in this presentation, some of the work that we've been doing and some of the work that I've done since moving to Michigan State in 2016, to continue this level of work that I think is very important for all of us to take interest in. One, the need to capitalize on youth demographic dividend, and to nurture creativity and innovation around sport and exercise sciences, leisure studies. Next slide, please. All right. Move to the next one. I want to move to a very important part of the presentation because of time factors. Now, here is an important thing that I think for you would be beneficial. What are we talking about? It's because we have a limited understanding of this. It's very important to understand sport and exercise science and leisure studies have a lot in common, but they are different. I tend to come from the sport and exercise science area, which may be aligned to health, physical activity, and impact on mental health and those kinds of things. But it is the interest that I would like you to look at, which is related to the broader definition of sport, that it encompasses all of those aspects that deal with the sports enterprise itself, as well as all value additions and services associated with that. Let's go to the next. I want to now explain the concept of leisure, which actually Paul and Cassandra has spent time talking about in that book chapter on leisure in urban Africa. With leisure, we're thinking about obligatory time for joy, rest, creativity, and mental well-being, which encompasses various pursuits. All right, and the concept, the way it has been developed in Western countries might be different from how Africa understands it. In Western countries, a lot of it has been done. It's not huge in terms of economic impacts, but in terms of it as a subject of study, a lot has been done in this area. And you may find it in parks and recreation departments. You may find it in business departments and so on and so forth. You will not typically find it in kinesiology department where I'm based. But a lot of it, has been around, for instance, increasing individual time in leisure activities, whether it's jogging, running, or music and art. Kayla, thank you very much for your presentation because you actually touched onto that. And thank you, Prof, for your presentation as well on that because that's very important. So there's an element of commodification of this, the structure, residual time around work, and you'll find that in the definition that is provided in the book that Paul and Cassandra co-edited. But in the African context, here we're thinking about emphasis on community, informal as well as informal experiences, spirituality, interconnectedness, as well as cultural identity and resilience. And this resilience component came up in Kayla's presentation. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I'm actually referencing Paul's book because of its profound impact in an area within an African context of the study of leisure. This edited book is one of a kind because there are not so many out there, where it provides insights on the topic across the continent, but centers on the city and urban life, particularly in post-colonial Africa, where you see new mining companies coming in, industries coming in, and how they perceive leisure and leisure activities, going to play soccer or rugby or cricket, music and dance, and then with the local community or the locals not seeing a similar type of, developing a similar type of interest until later on. But we can see, for instance, with the growth of football and how football could have emanated from these introductions by these companies in, we can say, in the Copper Belt in Zambia or maybe in other places, and how that transformed, the way we view leisure and leisure studies. So again, what is interesting about this is that we're looking at ways in which interdisciplinary studies of how leisure shapes urban identity becomes very important to look at, the historical elements of it, also the epistemological ways of studying it that are very important to look at. It makes a compelling case for integrating leisure into African scholarship, especially in higher education. It also actually helps us understand ways in which this concept has devolved, has grown, and also been understood in the African context, with the idea that, as the way Paul puts it, we have to be avoiding intellectual parochialism, by looking at leisure as just one thing without even looking at economic impacts, without even looking at the impact on the individual, spirituality, health, well-being, and all of those issues. Right, let's move on to the next slide. Right, so again, I want to touch on the importance of my work and our work collaborating with different individuals, catalysts for personal growth, inclusion, mental health, building life skills and social bonds and economic opportunity for young people. This is the focus of the work that I've been building at Michigan State. Let's move on to the next slide. It has a Pan-African interdisciplinary research approach and outreach, and also looking at ways in which we can embrace many countries into this. It's very hard to actually expand the way we like to, but having the capacity to build partnership like this has been one of the most important things, and of course with the support of AAP and others. So we started with the work in Botswana, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, and then included Nigeria. Next slide, please. And then we, of course, with the work in Nigeria recently, or with all of these 4 countries, we have been able to do a number of projects, including the ones with COVID looking at health, using an app, a voice-related app, to collect data on COVID impact on those communities and mental health, physical activity and mental health. Next slide. All right, I want to move forward as quickly as possible. So the goals of the collaboration, youth empowerment is central to this through physical activity and leisure. Health and well-being, very important to me, and that's one of the topics I've been working on. Also the idea of engendering a shift from a deficit approach or paradigm about African development into more of a positive outlook. This is very important. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to mention that one of the things that I'm doing with this kind of work is also interfacing the work in Africa with work in communities here, underserved communities in the United States, particularly in the state of Michigan. Next slide. So now, I have an interest in sustainability. Why youth? Because we want to capitalize on the youth dividend, the power of youth, youth creativity and innovation. Let's go to the next slide. The African Alliance for Youth Sport and Entrepreneurship project actually looks at positive youth development as a tenet of focus because it's asset-based. It also focuses on optimal development experiences and involvement of young people. We're looking at skills development in sport to support individual success in situations outside of sports, which is application, the same as in leisure studies. Let's go to the next slide. This approach is one of the ways that I started the work, but I'm actually now moving and transitioning into more of an intentional exploration of African paradigms, African epistemologies to infuse in this work. Coming from the background of psychology, you see I'm going to be struggling to kind of get out of the self into something that defines me and my cultural experiences. So I can call the PYD model that I mentioned earlier as more like a kitchen sink approach of everything. That is not optimal, which is why there's need to move away from it and get into something much more rewarding and exciting. But the key thing here is harnessing the power of sport for impacting youth development outcomes. And in some of the intervention work that we have been doing and that we continue in Michigan right now, that we've done with Ghana, Tanzania, and Botswana, we infuse entrepreneurship lessons and life skills, entrepreneurship ideation for youth outcomes. Let's move to the next slide, okay? Let's go to the next one. These are life skills that we have actually covered and are very important. This is an example of the impact of our intervention work in Botswana, Ghana, and Tanzania, doing a quasi-experimental design, as you want to call it, looking at pre-post. So it's an intervention that has a follow-up study in it. And you can see the impact of an intervention of being intentional about change in youth livelihoods and how that actually affects young people with entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ideation. Let's go to the next slide. This is the work in Kenya. This was funded by USAID. I had to serve as a principal investigator working with International University, United States International University and Egerton University in Kenya, also the National Youth Bunge Association of Kenya, and other organizations that are there, county governments to co-create. And the focus of this work was on increasing youth economic opportunities, building higher education capacities, as well as also empowering or strengthening youth service systems. Let's go to the next slide. All right. The key takeaways of this work is that, one, optimal development experiences are possible with intentional approaches and the kind of philosophy that Cassandra and Paul have laid the foundation for that I would like all of us to take interest in, from history and so many other areas. Transfer of skills from sport to non-sport development outcomes, and so on and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. I don't need to spend time here because I'm not giving a keynote, all right? So this is the model that I have been propagating that I would like us to take interest in, that I feel needs to be done. And I would like the Mecca and many other historical Black colleges and universities to take interest in this. I would like the Caribbean to take interest in this. I would like Latin America. You know, we go to here. We want them to take interest in this. I want all the states in the state in Michigan to take interest in this model. We talk about an integrated, inclusive sport and exercise science and leisure ecosystem. It is possible. All right. In this framework, key things that we are looking at is the importance of, you know, a broad spectrum of programs being developed. One, another thing that is very important from here, I think I cannot take this. So what you see here is youth sport, exercise science, and leisure studies and services. Yeah, this one, okay. All right. What number is it? Turn it on, please. It looks on, it looks on. Number 3, turn it on. 3? Yeah. There you go. Very quickly. So we have youth sport and exercise science, leisure studies, combining everything, sport and exercise science, leisure value chains, industries, including the private sector, investment and technology, knowledge action frameworks that influence practice. And here we're thinking about Ubuntu, we're thinking about African epistemologies, you know, and so on and so forth. A quadruple helix where government, society, industry, and academia developing, you know, innovative strategies for program development, strengthening local capacities, national, regional, Pan-African, and global partnerships. And this is why I'm talking about the United States, Latin America, the diaspora. You go wherever the Black communities are, they have to see themselves in this. And then, of course, the sport and leisure across the lifespan, gender, disability, inclusive approaches to this kind of work. Let's move to the next slide. All right? So, in conclusion, what I'm saying is that there's need for a systematic research and theoretical paradigms to study sport and exercise science and leisure in African context, African knowledge culture, systems, and Africa included diaspora. Significant investment in curriculum development and training, reimagine education through joy, connection, and culture, strong national and regional Pan-African frameworks, very important, as well as building broader stakeholder collaborations to accelerate inclusive transformation, as well as an international gender equity and social inclusion. Those are very important things that I think should happen and where the conversations must be. And I'm glad to be here because this is a journey, what I call a journey of rediscovery in scholarship. And it has to come back to the Mecca, all right? Connecting the Mecca and Africa, all right? I think this must be the last slide. I had a video that I wanted to show. It's 3 minutes, but don't worry about it. Here I'm thanking the different partners that we're working with within the African continent, including the state of Michigan, the funders, and everybody. In the video that I was going to share with you, which I had to cut short because of time, the key thing there is I'm showing a collaborative partnership, interdisciplinary collaborative partnership. It's actually transdisciplinary because we also have a community organization and a media organization. But I have colleagues from engineering, with infrastructure, sensors. And I'm bringing in the sports psychology, physical activity perspective. And then we have people in business and physical exercise physiology, all combined and coming together to build a project that allows kids to go on a camp, learn how to do coding using Python, and develop an engineering project. We walk around the city, and this is what we did. Spend time, working around the city of Gaborone. They identify specific problems, whether it's access to recreational facilities, walkways, time, and that is available, light system, and then they create a problem using an app. And I have a young group of people in that video that actually are talking about this project, showing the app. So this is what we can do, and this is what we should understand about this discipline. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ralph, and your entire team for these very inspiring presentations. So our 7 panels are going to culminate into a fireside chat that is chaired by Dr. Carol Boyce Davis, who is the chair of the English department at Howard University. And I'm going to defer to Dr. Davis to introduce her panelists.